Hi everyone, I wanted to send out some information about how to complete the Targeted Skills Profile, which is the next step of your SLO or your Student Learning Objective that's due next Friday the 16th. So if you haven't looked at it already, the Targeted Skills Profile is a second rubric that will be used to grade students as they work through this Student Learning Objective process, and it's a rubric that will be used more towards the end of the year. What you're going to do is you're going to log into your Eduphoria Strive account, and you're going to go back to your Student Learning Objective, or you have entered all of your Step 1 and Step 2 information. It will say submitted, but you can still go in and make changes to this document so long as you save it. So as you can see, this teacher has gone in already and completed Step 1 and also Step 2. Step 2 is this initial skills student profile, which reflects what your students were able to do or should be able to do at the beginning of the year before they have any real instruction with you. So as you can see, you, like this teacher, will have descriptors written for all of the different performance levels, and then you're going to have numbers of students at each of those levels. Again, this is a descriptor that's used for beginning of the year prior to instruction. So what this next piece is the Targeted Skills Profile. And as you can see, it's a rubric similar to the initial skills profile, but this one does not have spots for you to rank students because that's information that will be tracked at the end of the year on your student growth tracker. Like the initial skills profile, it does have boxes for you to write descriptors for each of these performance levels. Now the difference between this one and the initial one that you wrote is, again, this is an end of the year performance measure. One thing that confuses a lot of teachers is that when they look at a student's growth over time, they believe that if a student performed typically on an initial skills profile, then it's not appropriate that they would go and then perform typically on a targeted skills profile. Now, because the descriptors for these rubrics are different, it's perfectly reasonable to think that a student would go from typical to typical over the course of a year. Again, because the descriptors of the rubric are different, and you write this particular rubric as an end of the year performance versus the other one, which was a beginning of the year performance. So one thing that is helpful for teachers to look at is a document that kind of looks like this, and basically what this shows is this down here is your beginning of the year profile where students were on that initial skills profile rubric. So if you have a student that was typical beginning of the year performance, if he grows over time, his end of the year performance might also be typical, again because the descriptors that you write for each of those are different. One thing you might notice too is that a student who is typical at the beginning of the year, that performance descriptor might then become something that is well below typical for end of the year, because if your student is participating in a year's worth of instruction and they are not growing, then they would be considered below typical or not performing according to the instruction that they've received. So if you look at your student growth tracker, this particular teacher has gone in, as they should have, enlisted the students' names and then also mapped their students to the initial skill profile or that first rubric that you've written. Now, this particular teacher, I do know, also has done progress check number 1. It's just not listed here. I will say if you haven't done progress check number 1, it's probably a good idea to do so, and to do these every 6 or 7 weeks so that you don't get yourself in a position where it's the end of the year and you need to do several progress checks. Ideally, you're going to want all of the progress checks and the end of the year measure to be done by the beginning of May before your summative conference. So once you write that second targeted skills profile rubric, you're probably going to want to go in and set a goal for each of these kids. Like I mentioned before, it's perfectly appropriate for a student to go from typical to typical because the descriptors for typical student performance are different on these two rubrics. When you go in here, once you have written the descriptors for your end of the year or targeted skills profile, it's important that you're going to start to think about what piece of evidence you're going to use to measure that. Now, for a lot of you guys, you could use end of the year exams depending on how they align to the SLO itself. Another note that I think it's really important to mention is that you will need to keep track of the evidence that you collect over time for your students. So if you have any questions or concerns, please see your appraiser first, or you're more than welcome to track me down, and we can try to work through it together. Thank you.